Hey guys, welcome back to the garage. Today we are going to finish the ignition system portion of the engine tune-up procedure checklist by adjusting the ignition timing, and that'll be all for the ignition system. So let me start off by explaining the concept behind ignition timing adjustment, just in case there are novices in here, and generally it's important to know why you're doing this before you do it. I have this dirty piston that I dug out from the other engine for illustration purposes. So the piston travels up in its cylinder board to compress the fuel and air mixture. And when the piston is near at its highest point, the spark plug fires and the mixture, or the air and fuel mixture, is ignited to push the piston down in a controlled explosion. And this, in essence, is how your engine makes power. However, the ignition of the air and fuel mixture doesn't happen when the piston is at top dead center, because the full explosion of the fuel mixture doesn't happen instantaneously. So the ignition actually needs to happen slightly before piston gets to the top dead center to give the mixture enough time to ignite and explode. So as it reaches upwards, the mixture will ignite a little bit before, and then it'll go down. So generally, the faster the piston is traveling, the more advanced the ignition needs to be, because faster the piston is traveling, shorter amount of time that the mixture has to reach full combustion. That's why your ignition systems have some sort of mechanism to advance the timing based on the RPM. So for most Z owners, it'll be mostly through vacuum controls, since vacuum rises as RPM rises. And zeroing on the most optimal time for the ignition to happen in respect to the position of the piston is how you make sure that your engine is producing full potential of the power that it's capable of making, given that you have proper air and fuel mixture. Now, getting it just right is important, because ignition timing that is too advanced will rob power, because the mixture is now trying to explode when the piston is trying to travel up. And ignition timing that is too retarded, or in other words delayed, will also rob power by not allowing enough time for the mixture to ignite. And this can result in backfiring, because then the piston will try to push the mixture out before it's fully spent. Then the unburned fuel will go to your exhaust pipe and explode there, which is what backfiring at the exhaust pipe is. So I guess this is all pretty simple concept, but it's hard to get it just right in reality, and I'll explain why. Of course, there is a manufacturer recommendation for what the ignition timing advance needs to be for your engine. For instance, for the L series engine, it's 10 degrees before top dead center at 800 idle RPM. But this is assuming that your engine is in nearly perfect condition with all stock parts, with zero vacuum leaks, no malfunctioning components, etc., etc. So the point that I'm trying to make is that your 40-year-old engine that have been through hundreds of thousands of miles, and probably multiple previous owners who may have made modifications along the way, it's actually rare that your engine's most optimal timing setting is exactly 10 degrees before top dead center. For instance, if you have a performance cam in your engine, which is really popular modification with these L series, the 10 degrees recommendation no longer applies to you. Same thing if you're running just a bit too rich or just a bit too lean. If your valve timing has been compromised because your timing chain is stretched, if your cylinders have been bored out to make a stroker, in all these cases, your optimal advance probably isn't exactly 10 degrees. So I say all of this just to say, unless you're adjusting your ignition timing at the dyno, this process is really more of an art than a science. You're essentially taking your best guess at what optimal timing setting is for your engine by staying fairly close to the manufacturer's recommendation and listening and feeling how the engine reacts as you adjust ignition timing. This is really why experts recommend spending the money to properly tune the car at a dyno, because no amount of throwing parts at your car is going to provide the assurance of longevity and help your engine reach its full potential like a good dyno session can. And eventually we will go do that together with this 280Z, and I'll show how this car does and tunes at the dyno. But this timing that we're going to set today is just for a few test drives and to get us to the dyno safely. And before I go to the dyno, I want to absolutely make sure that my air and fuel mixture is within the optimal range, so that the ignition timing that I'll find to be optimal for this engine that I'll try to zero in at the dyno, that won't really need to be changed for a while unless I make another drastic modifications to the engine. So in order to adjust your timing, all you really need is a timing light or a timing gun. And I actually really like this one because it tells me the engine RPM on the display. So timing lights are really pretty simple. It only requires 3 connections: 1 battery positive, 1 battery negative, and this induction clip, which will go around your first spark plug wire. So before you start the car, go ahead and hook the timing light on. Connect this to the battery positive. Connect this end to the battery negative. And at this point, your timing light should turn on if you have something like mine. It also tells me the battery voltage, which also comes in handy. And you're going to go ahead and connect this to the first spark plug wire. So we're just going to set the timing light aside and open up the garage and turn on the car. By the way, check out how fast this thing starts up. It starts up almost immediately now, without that 5-second delay of cranking. So you can see that the timing light is already working, but you want to set the timing when the engine is fully warmed up, so you can adjust the idle to exactly 800 and then set the timing. So the engine is now fully warmed up. It's been about 10 to 15 minutes. You can see that my engine RPM has settled in pretty nicely at 800, so no initial adjustment of the idle speed will be necessary, but if you need to do so, just take this screw, the idle adjustment screw on the throttle body, and just rotate it counterclockwise to increase the RPM, and rotate it clockwise to decrease the RPM. So we're going to take this timing light and point it at the crank wheel. So my timing seems to be at around 12 or 13 degrees before top dead center, so I'll need to adjust it. To adjust the timing, we'll need to loosen the distributor timing screw. But don't loosen it so much that your distributor is just going to flop around. So in my case, I need to retard the timing. So what I'm going to do is grab the distributor and rotate it counterclockwise to retard the timing. I only need to adjust it maybe 2 degrees. If you want to advance your timing, you take the distributor and spin it clockwise. That'll advance the timing. So I spun my distributor ever so slightly counterclockwise, and now we are at exactly 10 degrees before top dead center. After you're done adjusting, you want to check back in on your engine RPM and adjust the screw back to 800. We're going to check the timing again one more time. And it's still very close to 10 degrees before top dead center. So at this point, we're going to lock it down. Now, there are more complicated ways or more advanced ways to do this. For instance, you could try to check the ignition timing at different points in the RPM. Let's say at 2,000 and 3,000 RPM, especially if you're unsure if your vacuum advanced mechanism on your distributor isn't working correctly. You could also hook up a vacuum gauge to the engine, probably at the brake booster, to see how your engine's vacuum levels respond to the timing adjustments. Generally speaking, higher the vacuum level, the better. But I'll end by repeating this note that I shared earlier. The ignition timing that we just set on the car is really temporary. We're only doing this so that we can go on a few test drives and get to the dyno, and at the dyno is where we'll really zero in on the most optimal ignition advanced level for this engine and the car. And we can do that because we can see how the engine's power production changes as you adjust the ignition timing between runs. That's really the most optimal or the best way, maybe the only way, to make sure that you have the most or the best ignition timing for your engine. So that's it for today. Next time, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I imagine it's going to be probably like oil pressure testing, but we're done with the ignition system testing, so hooray. I'll see you guys next time.